People lived in cities long before anyone thought to write about them. The cities were small by later standards but larger than the villages around them. Stone walls enclosed spaces where many people gathered to live and work. The walls were built from materials found nearby in the landscape around the settlements. Mud bricks dried in the sun provided the substance for most structures within the walls. People shaped the bricks in wooden molds and left them to harden slowly in open air. Streets formed between buildings where people moved from one place to another each day. The streets were narrow and turned at angles determined by the buildings beside them. Dust collected in the streets when the weather remained dry for extended periods of time. Rain turned the dust into mud that dried again when the rain stopped falling. People walked through the streets carrying tools and containers from their homes to other locations. The same routes were followed each day as people performed tasks that needed regular attention. Houses stood close together with shared walls separating one dwelling from the one beside it. Roofs were flat and made from wooden beams covered with layers of reed and mud. The roofs provided shelter from sun and rain for the people living below them. Small openings in the walls allowed air to move through interior spaces during warm seasons. Fires burned in hearths where food was prepared at regular times throughout each day. Water came from wells that had been dug deep into the ground in central locations. People carried water in ceramic vessels from the wells back to their homes each morning. The vessels were heavy when filled and required steady hands to transport without spilling. Some water was used for drinking and some for preparing food in cooking pots. Additional water served for washing hands and faces and for cleaning containers used in daily tasks. Fields stretched beyond the walls where crops grew during seasons when rainfall came regularly. People walked to the fields in the early morning when the air was still cool. They worked with simple tools made from wood and stone to tend plants that provided food. The work required bending and lifting and moving across the same ground repeatedly throughout growing seasons. Grain was stored in large jars and in rooms designated for keeping supplies safe. The grain came from harvests that happened once each year when crops reached maturity. People ground grain into flour using heavy stones that required sustained effort to operate properly. Bread was made from the flour and baked in clay ovens heated with burning wood. The bread was eaten at meals that marked divisions in each day's passing time. Animals were kept in pens near some dwellings where they could be fed and watched. The animals provided milk and meat and materials used for making various necessary items. People checked on the animals each day to ensure they had food and water. The work of maintaining animals happened in the same way across many consecutive days and seasons. People woke when light began to appear in the sky above their dwellings. The transition from darkness to light happened gradually as it had happened on previous mornings. Families stirred in rooms where they had been sleeping on mats laid across packed earth floors. The mats were woven from plant fibers and provided separation between bodies and the ground beneath them. People folded the mats and placed them against walls where they would remain until evening arrived again. Fires needed to be started in hearths that had gone cold during the night hours. Dry grass and small twigs were arranged in spaces designed for containing flames safely within stone boundaries. Larger pieces of wood were added once smaller materials began to burn with steady heat. The fire required attention to maintain proper burning throughout the time it was needed for tasks. Smoke rose from the flames and drifted toward openings in roofs where it dispersed into outside air. Water vessels were lifted and carried by people who walked to the nearest well in the settlement. Other people were also walking to the same well at the same time each morning. The well was deep and required rope and containers to draw water from the depth below ground level. People lowered containers attached to ropes and pulled them back up when they were filled with water. The filled containers were heavy and required careful handling during transport back to individual homes. Grain was measured from storage jars into smaller containers that could be managed more easily. The grain had been stored after the previous harvest and would be used until the next harvest provided more. Grinding stones were used to crush grain into powder that would become flour for making bread. The upper stone was moved in circular motions against the lower stone with grain placed between them. The work required steady pressure and repetitive movements that continued until enough flour had been produced. Dough was formed by mixing flour with water in shallow ceramic bowls used for this purpose. Hands worked the mixture until it reached a consistency suitable for shaping into flat rounds. The rounds were placed on hot stones near the fire or inside clay ovens that had been heated. Bread baked slowly as heat moved through the dough and changed its texture and appearance. The smell of baking bread filled interior spaces and drifted into streets outside dwellings. Children were given tasks appropriate to their size and strength within family households. Young children carried small amounts of water or helped with sorting dried grains from debris. Older children worked alongside adults performing similar tasks at a slower pace or with less precision. The tasks were learned through repeated observation and practice over months and years of daily participation. Cloth needed to be woven from fibers that had been prepared during previous work sessions. The fibers came from plants grown in fields or from wool taken from animals kept nearby. Looms were set up in spaces where light was sufficient for seeing the work clearly. Threads were passed over and under other threads in patterns that had been used for generations. The work proceeded slowly as each row was added to the growing length of fabric material. Pots and containers required regular inspection to identify cracks or damage that might have developed over time. Broken vessels were set aside for disposal or repair depending on the extent of damage observed. Clay was sometimes used to patch small cracks in containers that were still useful for storage. New pots were made when old ones could no longer serve their intended functions adequately. Food was prepared at times that divided the day into predictable segments of activity and rest. Vegetables were cut into pieces using knives made from sharpened stone or metal when available. The pieces were placed in pots with water and set over fires to cook slowly. Cooking times varied depending on the type of food being prepared and the intensity of heat applied. People stirred the contents of pots occasionally to prevent ingredients from sticking to ceramic surfaces. Meals were eaten while sitting on floors or on low benches placed near walls and dwelling interiors. Food was served in shared containers from which individuals took portions using their hands or simple utensils. Eating happened without conversation in some households and with quiet talk in others about ordinary matters. Finished meals left containers that needed to be cleaned with water and returned to their storage places. Floors were swept using bundled plant materials that collected dust and small debris from packed earth surfaces. The sweeping happened each day to maintain spaces in a condition considered acceptable for daily living. Dust was pushed toward doorways and deposited outside in streets or in designated areas near buildings. The same floors would be swept again the following day in the same manner. Tools were checked to ensure they remained in working condition for upcoming tasks that would require their use. Wooden handles were examined for cracks that might cause them to break during heavy work. Stone edges were assessed for sharpness and effectiveness in cutting or scraping materials as needed. Worn tools were set aside to be repaired or replaced when time and materials became available. Animals in pens needed food and water provided at regular intervals throughout each day. Hay or grain was carried to feeding areas where animals could access it easily. Water troughs were filled from vessels carried from wells or from other nearby water sources. Animals were observed briefly to ensure they appeared healthy and were behaving in expected ways. The pens were cleaned periodically to remove waste that accumulated from the animal's daily presence. Clothing was inspected for tears or worn areas that needed repair before further use. Needle and thread were used to mend small holes or to reinforce seams that had begun to separate. The work was done while sitting in positions that allowed clear visibility of the fabric being repaired. Repaired garments were folded and returned to places where clothing was kept between periods of wear. People moved between their homes and other locations in the settlement throughout the daylight hours available. The movement followed familiar paths worn smooth by repeated foot traffic over long periods of time. Neighbors were encountered in streets and brief acknowledgments were exchanged before each person continued onward. The encounters were unremarkable and similar to exchanges that had happened on previous days and would happen again. Doorways needed to be swept clear of dust that accumulated from wind and from foot traffic passing through. The sweeping was done with the same bundled materials used for interior floor cleaning tasks. Thresholds showed wear from the constant passage of people moving in and out of dwellings regularly. The wear was expected and did not require any response beyond continued use of the spaces. Baskets were used to transport items from one location to another within homes and between different buildings. The baskets were woven from flexible plant materials that had been soaked and shaped while damp. Handles were attached to allow carrying without requiring both hands to support the basket's weight entirely. Empty baskets were stacked inside dwellings when not in use for any specific task at hand. Ashes from fires were removed when they accumulated to levels that interfered with maintaining new flames. The ashes were carried outside in containers and deposited in areas away from doorways and pathways. New fires were built in the cleaned hearths using the same materials and methods as before. The process repeated each day as fires were allowed to die down during hours of darkness. Stored grain was checked periodically to ensure it remained dry and free from pests or spoilage. Containers holding grain were opened and the contents examined by sight and by hand contact. Any signs of moisture or insect activity prompted removal of affected portions before they could spread further. The checking happened at intervals determined by past experience with storage conditions in similar containers. Walls required occasional maintenance to repair cracks that appeared from settling or from seasonal temperature changes. Mud plaster was mixed with water and applied to damaged areas using hands or flat tools. The plaster dried slowly and hardened to match the surrounding wall surface in color and texture. Repaired sections were inspected after drying to determine if additional applications of plaster were needed for durability. Rope was made from twisted plant fibers that had been dried and prepared for this purpose. The fibers were rolled and twisted together until they formed continuous lengths of usable rope. Finished rope was coiled and stored in dry locations where it would remain until needed. Making rope happened during times when other tasks did not require immediate attention from available workers. Morning work continued as the sun rose higher in the sky above the settlement. The same tasks were performed in the same spaces where they had been done before. Hands moved through familiar motions without requiring conscious thought about each individual action taken. The work proceeded at a steady pace that matched the pace maintained on other mornings. Fields beyond the walls needed regular attention from people who walked there each day. The walking happened along paths that connected the settlement to the cultivated areas outside. Tools were carried on shoulders or held in hands during the walk to the fields. The distance remained constant and the time required to cover it did not change significantly. Soil was turned using wooden implements with sharpened edges or metal points when such tools were available. The turning of soil loosened earth that had become compacted from previous seasons of use. Loose soil allowed plant roots to extend downward more easily as they grew during warm months. The work required bending and straightening in repeated cycles that continued across sections of each field. Seeds were placed in soil at depths and intervals determined by established practices for each type of plant. Small holes were made using fingers or pointed sticks pushed into the loosened earth. Seeds were dropped into the holes and covered with soil brushed over them by hand. The planting happened in rows that extended across the length of fields in parallel lines. Weeds grew between planted crops and needed removal to prevent competition for water and nutrients. The weeds were pulled from the ground by hand or cut near their base with small blades. Removed weeds were gathered and carried to edges of fields where they were left to dry. The same areas required weeding again after some days had passed and new growth appeared. Water channels directed moisture from sources to fields where it could reach the roots of plants. The channels were simple depressions cut into earth that guided water along gentle slopes toward lower areas. Blockages in the channels were cleared when they prevented water from flowing at the expected rate. Clearing involved removing accumulated soil or debris that had settled in the channel bottom. Plants were observed as they grew to identify any signs of disease or damage from insects. Affected plants were sometimes removed to prevent problems from spreading to neighboring plants in the same row. The observations happened during regular visits to fields for other routine maintenance and care tasks. Each visit involved walking between rows and looking at plants from a close distance. Harvesting happened when crops reached a stage of maturity indicated by their appearance and texture. Plants were cut or pulled from the ground depending on which part was being harvested. Collected portions were placed in baskets or bundled together with cord for easier transport to storage areas. The harvesting required many hands working together to complete the task within available time. Grain was separated from stalks and husks through processes that involved beating or rubbing the harvested material. The work was done on flat surfaces where separated grain could be collected without significant loss. Lighter chaff was removed by tossing grain in shallow baskets while wind carried away unwanted material. The cleaned grain was transferred to storage containers kept in designated buildings or rooms within dwellings. People returned from fields when the sun reached positions that indicated the middle part of the day. The return walk followed the same paths used during the morning journey to the fields. Tools were carried back and placed in storage locations where they would remain until the next day. Hands and feet were often dusty from contact with dry soil throughout the morning's work activities. Additional meals were prepared using methods similar to those used for earlier food in the day. Fires that had been maintained since morning provided heat for cooking without needing to be restarted completely. Pots were cleaned from previous use and filled with new ingredients and water for the next meal. The cooking happened while people rested in shaded areas or attended to other small tasks inside dwellings. Leather required treatment to remain flexible and usable for making various items needed in daily life. Animal hides were scraped to remove hair and tissue that remained attached after initial processing. The scraped hides were soaked in solutions made from plant materials or other substances that prevented decay. Treated leather was stretched and dried in positions that kept it flat until it hardened sufficiently. Finished leather was cut into shapes needed for sandals or bags or other objects that required durable material. Cutting was done with sharp blades following patterns that had been used for similar items previously. Pieces were joined by stitching or by lacing through holes punched along edges with pointed tools. Completed items were used until they wore out and needed replacement with newly made versions. Pottery was shaped from clay that had been collected from locations where suitable material could be found. The clay was moistened and worked with hands until it reached a consistency that allowed shaping. Pots were formed by coiling long rolls of clay in circular patterns that built up the walls. The surfaces were smoothed by hand while the clay remained workable and responsive to pressure applied. Shaped pottery was left to dry slowly in shaded areas protected from direct sun that might cause cracking. The drying took time measured in days rather than hours before pieces were ready for firing. Dried pots were placed in fires or special kilns where high heat hardened the clay permanently. Fired pottery was removed after cooling and inspected for cracks or other flaws that might limit usefulness. Repairs to roofs happened when leaks developed or when materials showed signs of deterioration from exposure. Bundles of reeds or grass were carried to roof surfaces and laid in layers over damaged sections. The new material was packed down and secured with mud to hold it in position. Repaired areas were checked after rain to determine if additional work was needed for adequate protection. Woodworking required tools that could shape and smooth pieces cut from larger timbers available in the area. Axes and adzes were used to remove excess wood and create desired forms from rough material. The shaping happened gradually through repeated cutting and trimming until dimensions were satisfactory for intended purposes. Finished pieces were set aside to dry further before being incorporated into construction or tool assembly. Cord was made from plant fibers processed through twisting and braiding to create strong, flexible lengths. The fibers were first separated from plant stalks through soaking and beating to break down surrounding material. Clean fibers were twisted together while damp to form single strands that were then combined into thicker cord. Finished cord was wound into bundles and stored in dry conditions until needed for tying or binding. Dyeing of cloth or fiber happened using materials extracted from plants or minerals found in local environments. The materials were boiled in water to release color that would transfer to fibers soaked in the liquid. Fibers remained in dye baths for periods that varied depending on the depth of color desired. Dyed materials were rinsed and hung to dry in locations where excess liquid could drip away. Children played in spaces between buildings during times when they were not occupied with a sign. Tasks. The play involved running and throwing objects and games with simple rules understood by all participants. Adults working nearby occasionally glanced toward playing children but did not interrupt unless necessary for safety reasons. The play ended when children were called back to help with household work or meals. Elderly people sat in shaded areas during the warmest parts of the day and performed light tasks. Their hands worked with materials for mending or sorting that did not require physical strength or mobility. Younger people brought them water or food and consulted them about methods for completing certain kinds of work. The elderly remained in the same positions for extended periods without moving to other locations frequently. Stones were gathered from fields and from areas near the settlement where they appeared on the surface. The stones were carried to building sites or to locations where they would be used for grinding. Large stones required multiple people to lift and transport them to where they were needed. Smaller stones were collected in baskets and moved by single individuals working alone or with minimal assistance. Oil was pressed from seeds or nuts using heavy stones that crushed the material and released liquid. The crushed material was placed in cloth and squeezed to extract additional oil that had not drained freely. Collected oil was stored in sealed containers kept in cool, dark places to preserve quality. The oil was used for lamps or for cooking or for treating wood and leather surfaces. Afternoon hours brought continuation of work that had been started earlier in the day. People moved between tasks as each one reached a point where it could be left temporarily. The transitions happened without discussion in most cases as everyone understood the usual sequence of activities. Hands that had been occupied with one type of work shifted to another type of work. Spinning transformed prepared fibers into thread that could be woven or used for sewing and repairs. The fibers were drawn out and twisted using simple tools that rotated to add tension. The rotation happened through steady repetitive motion that continued until sufficient thread had been produced. Finished thread was wound onto sticks or formed into loose bundles for storage until needed. Threshing floors were swept clean before grain was brought there for processing after harvest periods. The sweeping removed small stones and debris that might contaminate the grain during separation work. Bundles of harvested grain were spread across the clean surface in layers of even thickness. People or animals walked over the spread grain to break seeds free from their covering structures. Winnowing separated grain from lighter material by tossing it into moving air on the threshing floor. The grain fell back to the ground while chaff was carried away by wind currents. The process was repeated multiple times until the grain appeared sufficiently clean for collection and storage. Collected grain was transferred to containers and carried to buildings designated for keeping it safe. Milk was obtained from animals kept in pens near dwellings where they could be attended regularly. The animals were brought to areas where milking could be done in positions comfortable for the workers. Containers were held beneath the animals while hands worked to draw milk in steady streams. The milk was poured into vessels and taken to cool locations where it would be kept. Cheese was made from milk that had been treated with substances that caused it to separate into solid and liquid portions. The solid portions were gathered and pressed to remove excess liquid and create dense blocks. The pressing happened using weights placed on top of cloth-wrapped curds for extended periods of time. Finished cheese was stored in conditions that allowed it to age before being consumed. Fuel for fires needed to be gathered from areas where wood or dried plant material could be found. People walked to these areas carrying tools for cutting or breaking larger pieces into manageable sizes. The collected fuel was bundled or stacked and carried back to the settlement for storage near dwellings. The gathering happened regularly to maintain supplies adequate for daily cooking and heating needs. Kindling was prepared by breaking small branches and twigs into pieces short enough to fit in hearths. The pieces were kept dry in protected locations where they would remain ready for use. Starting fires required having adequate kindling available to build flames from initial sparks or embers. The preparation of kindling happened during time that might otherwise have been unoccupied by other tasks. Shoes were made from leather cut and shaped to protect feet during walking on rough surfaces. The leather was softened through soaking and then formed around foot-shaped forms while still damp. Pieces were stitched together using strong thread made from plant fibers or thin strips of leather. Finished shoes were worn until they developed holes or separated at seams and required replacement. Mats for sleeping were woven from reeds or grasses gathered from wet areas near water sources. The gathered materials were dried and sorted according to length and thickness before weaving began. The weaving happened by interlacing individual pieces in patterns that created stable flat surfaces of appropriate size. Completed mats were rolled and stored or placed directly in locations where they would be used. Washing of clothing happened in water carried to dwellings or at water sources where clothes could be submerged. The clothes were rubbed and beaten against stones to loosen dirt embedded in the fabric. Clean water was used for rinsing away soap or cleaning substances that had been applied. Washed items were wrung out and hung in sun or air to dry before being worn again. Hair was cut when it grew to lengths that interfered with work or became uncomfortable in warm weather. The cutting was done using sharp blades or sometimes by burning ends with controlled application of heat. Cut hair was discarded or saved for potential use in making other materials that required fiber. The cutting happened irregularly based on individual preference and practical need rather than on fixed schedules. Beards were trimmed or removed entirely depending on personal choice and prevailing customs within the settlement. The trimming used the same tools employed for cutting hair on heads and followed similar methods. Shaving required sharper implements and more careful attention to avoid cutting skin during the process. The maintenance of facial hair happened at intervals determined by how quickly it grew for each individual. Nails on hands and feet were kept short to prevent breaking or catching on materials during work. Trimming was done with small sharp blades or by wearing them down through contact with rough surfaces. The trimming happened when nails reached lengths that made tasks more difficult to perform efficiently. Broken nails were smoothed by rubbing against stones or other abrasive materials available for this purpose. Teeth were cleaned by rubbing with fingers or with small sticks frayed at one end to create bristle-like fibers. Some people used substances made from plants that were believed to help maintain dental health. The cleaning happened at times of day when it seemed most necessary or convenient for those performing it. Dental problems were addressed when they occurred through methods available to people in the settlement. Bathing happened in water that was heated or used at whatever temperature it could be obtained. Bodies were washed using hands or cloths dipped in the water and rubbed over skin surfaces. The bathing took place in private areas within dwellings or at water sources away from common gathering places. Frequency of bathing varied among individuals based on personal habits and access to adequate water supplies. Containers holding water inside dwellings were refilled when levels dropped from use throughout the day. The refilling required trips to wells or other water sources with empty vessels that would be carried back full. Multiple trips were sometimes necessary to provide enough water for all purposes requiring it within a household. The task was often assigned to younger members of families who had strength for carrying but were learning other skills. Sitting in shade during the hottest parts of afternoon allowed rest from physical labor performed since morning. People gathered in groups or remained alone depending on their preference and the work they were doing. Conversation during these periods covered ordinary topics related to household matters or observations about conditions in the settlement. The rest periods lasted until the heat diminished enough to make resumed work more comfortable. Tools that had become dull from use were sharpened by grinding edges against abrasive stones kept for this purpose. The grinding required steady pressure and consistent angles to maintain proper edge geometry for cutting or scraping. Water was sometimes applied to the stone surface to reduce heat generated by friction during sharpening. Sharpened tools were returned to use and would eventually require sharpening again after sufficient work had dulled them. Fences around animal pens were inspected and repaired when damage was found that might allow animals to escape. The repairs used materials similar to those employed in original fence construction and followed the same methods. Broken pieces were removed and replaced with new sections cut to appropriate dimensions for the gaps. Completed repairs were tested by applying pressure to ensure they would hold under normal conditions. Pathways within the settlement developed ruts and uneven surfaces from repeated traffic over the same routes. The surfaces were sometimes leveled by adding soil or stones to fill low spots and create smoother walking areas. The leveling happened gradually as people noticed problematic sections and took steps to address them when convenient. Most pathways remained in their established locations and were maintained rather than relocated to different routes. Grain storage areas were kept as dry as possible to prevent moisture from spoiling the contents. Roofs over storage buildings were maintained with particular attention to preventing leaks during rainy periods. The floors were raised above ground level using stones or wooden platforms that allowed air circulation underneath. Regular inspection of stored grain helped identify any problems before they affected large portions of the supply. Olive trees grew in areas where soil and climate conditions supported their cultivation over many years. The trees required minimal care once established but needed occasional pruning to maintain productive growth patterns. Olives were harvested when they reached appropriate ripeness for the intended use of the fruit. The harvesting involved shaking branches or picking individual olives by hand depending on the situation and available labor. Later afternoon brought shifts in light that changed the appearance of familiar spaces within the settlement. Shadows lengthened across streets and courtyards as the sun moved lower toward the horizon line. The changes happened gradually and were noticed without particular attention being given to them by people at work. Tasks continued at the same pace they had maintained during earlier portions of the day. Bread that had been baked in the morning was consumed during the afternoon meal along with other prepared foods. The bread was broken into pieces and distributed among those gathered to eat together in household groups. Some bread was set aside for consumption later when evening brought the final meal of the day. Remaining portions were stored in containers or cloth wrappings to protect them from dust and insects. Grinding of grain continued as supplies of flour diminished from use in making the day's bread. The grinding stones were positioned in the same places they occupied every day for this work. Grain was added in small amounts between the upper and lower stones as the circular motion proceeded. The sound of stone against stone was a constant presence in many dwellings during grain processing times. Dust from grinding settled on surfaces near the work area and was swept away periodically. The sweeping did not remove all dust but kept accumulation from interfering with the work process. Fine particles remained suspended in air within the room and gradually settled after grinding activity stopped. The same dust would be generated again when grinding resumed on the following day. Vegetable gardens near dwellings received water carried from storage containers or directly from wells when needed. The water was poured carefully around the base of plants to avoid waste through runoff. Plants that showed signs of wilting were given priority when water supplies were limited by availability. The watering happened in late afternoon when heat from the sun had diminished somewhat from peak levels. Insects were present in gardens and needed to be removed from plants when their numbers became noticeable. The removal was done by hand or by shaking plants gently to dislodge the insects onto the ground. Some people used water to wash insects from plant leaves when this method proved more effective. The presence of insects was expected and the removal of them was simply another regular task. Herbs grown near dwellings were picked when they reached sizes suitable for use in cooking or for other household purposes. The picking involved selecting leaves or stems that appeared healthy and had reached appropriate maturity. Picked herbs were bundled together and hung in dry locations to preserve them for later use. Fresh herbs were also used immediately in meals being prepared that same day. Doors were left open during afternoon hours to allow air movement through interior spaces of dwellings. The moving air provided some relief from heat that accumulated inside rooms during the warmest part of the day. People moved in and out through open doorways as their work required them to go to different locations. The doors would be closed later when evening brought cooler temperatures and the day's work concluded. Benches placed along walls inside dwellings provided places to sit while performing tasks that did not require standing. The benches were simple wooden structures without backs or other features beyond a flat sitting surface. People sat on benches while mending clothes or preparing food or doing other work that allowed sitting. The same benches were used by different people throughout the day as needed for various purposes. Storage jars were organized along walls in rooms designated for keeping household supplies and equipment safe. The jars contained grain or dried foods or liquids that needed to be kept in sealed containers. Labels were not used and people knew the contents of each jar through familiarity with their placement. The jars were moved only when they needed to be refilled or when their contents were being used. Corners of rooms accumulated dust and debris that was swept out during regular cleaning of dwelling interiors. The corners were more difficult to clean than open floor areas and required extra attention with sweeping tools. Some debris remained in corners despite sweeping efforts and would be removed during more thorough cleaning sessions. The accumulation and removal of this material happened in cycles that repeated over time. Sealing areas above living spaces collected soot from fires burning in hearths below them over extended periods. The soot formed dark deposits on wooden beams and on mud plaster surfaces that covered structural elements. Cleaning of ceiling areas happened rarely compared to floor cleaning due to difficulty in reaching elevated surfaces. The darkening from soot was accepted as a normal condition in dwellings where fires burned regularly. Window openings allowed light into interior spaces during daytime hours when the sun was above the horizon. The openings were small and positioned to provide illumination without creating large gaps in protective walls. Some windows had coverings that could be closed to keep out wind or rain when weather conditions required. Most windows remained open during dry weather to maximize light and air circulation through rooms. Courtyard areas between buildings served as spaces for work that benefited from being done outside dwelling interiors. The courtyards were partially enclosed by surrounding walls that provided some protection from wind and dust. Paving or packed earth formed the surface of courtyards where people walked and worked throughout each day. Drainage allowed water to flow away from courtyards during rain so the areas would dry afterward. Ovens built into walls or standing as separate structures were used for baking bread and cooking other foods. The ovens were heated by burning fuel inside them until the interior surfaces reached appropriate temperatures. Food was placed inside after fuel had been removed or pushed to one side of the interior space. Heat retained in the oven walls cooked the food gradually as temperatures slowly decreased over time. Oven maintenance involved removing accumulated ash and checking for cracks in the clay or stone construction materials. Small cracks were repaired with fresh clay applied to the damaged areas while the oven was cool. Larger damage sometimes required rebuilding portions of the oven structure to ensure proper heat retention and safety. The maintenance happened as needed based on observation of the oven's condition during regular use. Clay used for repairs was kept in a damp condition ready for application when needed for various purposes. The clay was stored in covered containers that prevented it from drying out between uses. Additional water was mixed with the clay if it became too stiff to work easily with hands. Excess clay from repair work was returned to storage containers rather than being discarded as waste material. Ladders allowed access to roof surfaces where maintenance work needed to be performed on upper portions of buildings. The ladders were made from wooden poles with crosspieces attached at intervals to serve as steps. Climbing the ladders required care to maintain balance while carrying tools or materials to the roof. The ladders were leaned against walls at angles that provided stable support during use. Roof surfaces were walked on carefully to avoid damaging the layers of material that provided protection from weather. The walking was done only when necessary for repairs or for accessing stored items kept on flat roof areas. Foot traffic created wear on roof materials that would eventually require replacement of damaged sections. The wear was minimized by limiting unnecessary movement across roof surfaces to preserve their protective function. Adjacent dwellings shared common walls that reduced the amount of material needed for construction of individual units. The shared walls required cooperation between neighbors regarding maintenance and repairs that affected both properties. Decisions about wall maintenance were made through discussion between the parties whose dwellings were connected by the structure. The arrangements worked adequately in most cases without significant disagreement between involved parties. Public wells served multiple households in areas where individual wells were not practical or possible to construct. The wells were maintained through collective effort by people who used them for daily water needs. Cleaning of well areas and repairs to wall structures happened when enough people agreed it was necessary. The shared responsibility for well maintenance generally ensured the wells remained functional over long periods of use. Evening approached as the sun continued its movement lower in the sky above the settlement. The light became softer and took on qualities different from the harsh brightness of midday hours. People working outside began to finish tasks they had been performing and prepared to return to their dwellings. The transition from afternoon to evening happened without abrupt changes in activity or pace of work. Animals were guided back to their pens from areas where they had been grazing during the day. The animals moved slowly along familiar routes that connected grazing areas to the settlement enclosures. People walked behind or alongside the animals to keep them moving in the intended direction toward home. The animals entered their pens and settled into positions they would occupy until the following morning. Gates on animal pens were closed and secured with simple latches or ties that prevented animals from pushing them open. The closing of gates happened at the same time each evening as part of the regular routine. People checked the gates after closing them to ensure they were properly secured for the night ahead. The same gates would be opened again in the morning when animals needed to leave the pens. Final meals of the day were prepared using ingredients that had been set aside during earlier food preparation. Fires that had burned throughout the day were fed additional fuel to maintain heat for cooking this meal. Pots were filled with water and food items and placed over the flames to heat slowly. The cooking proceeded while other tasks were completed in preparation for the end of the working day. Children were called to come inside from areas where they had been playing during late afternoon. The calling happened when adults determined it was time for the evening meal to be served. Children returned to their dwellings and washed hands in water provided for this purpose before eating. The washing removed dirt accumulated from playing in streets and courtyards throughout the afternoon hours. Tables or low platforms served as surfaces where food containers were placed for serving during meals. The surfaces were at heights convenient for people sitting on floors or on benches while eating. Food was distributed from shared containers to individual portions consumed by each person present at the meal. Eating proceeded quietly in some households and with conversation in others depending on family customs and preferences. Bowls and cups were cleaned after meals using water and cloths or plant materials that scoured surfaces. The cleaning removed food residue that would attract insects or develop unpleasant odors if left on containers. Cleaned items were set aside to dry before being returned to storage locations where they were kept. The drying happened in air that circulated through the dwelling from open doorways and window openings. Evening air was cooler than afternoon air and made the interior of dwellings more comfortable for occupancy. People sat in doorways or near windows to take advantage of the moving air that entered through these openings. The sitting happened after work had been completed and meals had been consumed and cleaned up properly. Conversation during this time covered events of the day or plans for work to be done tomorrow. Lamps were prepared for use when natural light diminished to levels that made seeing difficult inside dwellings. The lamps were simple vessels that held oil with wicks extending upward through small openings in the top. Oil was checked to ensure sufficient quantity remained for the time the lamp would need to burn. Additional oil was added when levels appeared low enough to risk the lamp going out prematurely. Wicks were trimmed to appropriate lengths that would burn steadily without producing excessive smoke in dwelling interiors. The trimming was done using small blades or by pinching away charred portions with fingers when the lamp was not burning. Fresh wicks were installed when old ones became too short to function properly for lighting purposes. The preparation of lamps happened regularly as part of the transition from daylight to darkness each evening. Flames were started in lamp wicks using embers carried from cooking fires in small containers or on sticks. The embers were brought close to the wick until the oil-soaked material caught fire and began burning. The flame was adjusted by moving the wick up or down slightly to achieve desired brightness without smoking. Multiple lamps were lit in dwellings where more light was needed for evening activities to continue. Mending of clothing and other fabric items happened during evening hours when people had completed other required work. The mending was done by lamplight or by remaining daylight that entered through doorways before full darkness arrived. Needles and thread were used to close tears or to reinforce areas showing wear from repeated use. The work proceeded slowly with careful attention to creating repairs that would hold through additional wearing and washing. Stories were sometimes told during evening hours by older people who remembered events from earlier times in their lives. The stories were listened to by younger people who had not experienced the events being described in the telling. The same stories were told repeatedly over time and became familiar to all who heard them regularly. The telling served to pass time during evening hours and to maintain memory of past occurrences. Sleep preparations began when people felt tired from the day's activities and ready to rest until morning. Sleeping mats were unrolled and positioned on floors in locations where they would remain throughout the night. Light coverings were arranged over the mats to provide warmth if the night air became cool enough to require them. People settled onto the mats in positions they would maintain through hours of sleep ahead. Lamps were extinguished when they were no longer needed for seeing inside the darkened dwelling spaces. The extinguishing was done by blowing out flames or by covering them with small vessels that cut off air. Smoke from extinguished lamps drifted upward and out through roof openings along with smoke from cooking fires. Darkness filled the interior spaces once the lamps were out and only faint light from outside remained visible. Fires in hearths were allowed to burn down to glowing embers that would remain alive until morning. The embers would make starting the next day's fire easier than beginning from nothing with new sparks. A small amount of ash was sometimes placed over embers to slow their burning during the night hours. The hearth was left unattended as people settled into sleep and the dwelling became quiet and still. Sounds from outside continued after people inside dwellings had ceased their activities for the night. Animals in pens shifted position or made occasional sounds that carried through the quiet evening air. Other households nearby could be heard through walls as people there completed their own evening preparations. The sounds were familiar and expected parts of the nighttime environment in the settlement. Streets were empty of traffic once darkness had fully arrived and people had retired to their dwellings. The streets would remain empty through the night until morning brought the first movements of the new day. Dust that had been raised during the day's foot traffic settled back onto the street surfaces. The settled dust would be disturbed again when morning activity resumed in the same streets and pathways. Walls of dwellings retained some warmth from the day's sun even after darkness had made the air outside cooler. The retained warmth gradually dissipated through the night as the walls radiated heat into the surrounding air. By morning the walls would be cool again and would begin absorbing heat from the rising sun. The cycle of warming and cooling repeated itself with each passing day and night in regular succession. Guards or watchmen sometimes walked through the settlement during night hours to observe conditions and ensure security. The walking followed routes that covered all areas of the settlement at intervals throughout the night. The presence of guards was maintained in settlements large enough to have people designated for this specific purpose. Smaller settlements relied on residents to notice and respond to any unusual occurrences during dark hours. Dogs that lived in the settlement sometimes barked during the night at sounds or movements they detected. The barking would wake some people briefly before they returned to sleep when the disturbance passed. Most dogs slept during the night as people did and were quiet unless something prompted them to respond. The presence of dogs added to the security of the settlement through their alertness to unusual activity. Darkness settled completely over the settlement as the last traces of daylight disappeared from the sky. The darkness was total in areas away from any lamps that continued burning inside dwellings. Stars became visible overhead in patterns that had been observed by previous generations in the same location. The stars remained in their positions through the night hours until dawn began to lighten the sky again. Sleep came to most people within a short time after they had settled onto their mats. The sleep was deep at first and then became lighter as the night progressed toward morning. Some people woke briefly during the night and then returned to sleep without rising from their positions. The waking was caused by various small disturbances that did not require any response or action. Breathing of sleeping people created the only sounds inside dwellings once all activity had stopped for the night. The breathing was steady and quiet in most cases with occasional variations in rhythm or depth. Children slept without moving much from their initial positions on their mats throughout the night. Adults shifted position occasionally to maintain comfort on the hard surfaces beneath their sleeping bodies. Temperature inside dwellings dropped during the night as heat from the day dissipated through walls and roofs. The cooling was gradual and most people did not notice it during sleep unless it became uncomfortable. Coverings were pulled closer around bodies when the cooling reached levels that made the additional warmth desirable. The same coverings would be pushed aside again when morning brought warmer temperatures back to interior spaces. Morning began when the sky started to show the first signs of approaching daylight before the sun itself appeared. The change from complete darkness to gray pre-dawn light happened slowly over a period of time. People in dwellings remained asleep during this early transition as no work required their attention before actual sunrise. The settlement remained quiet and still during these early moments of the new day beginning. Birds began to make sounds as light increased and their activity for the day commenced in the usual pattern. The sounds of birds were among the first indicators that morning had arrived and night had ended. People inside dwellings heard the bird sounds as part of the familiar pattern that marked the beginning of each day. The sounds did not wake people who were still deeply asleep but were noticed by those already stirring. First movements inside dwellings came from people who woke early from habit or from the natural ending of their sleep. The movements were quiet to avoid disturbing others who were still sleeping on their mats nearby. Early risers sat up and remained still for some moments before standing and beginning their morning activities. The transition from sleep to wakefulness happened gradually without any particular urgency or rush to begin work immediately. Hearths were approached by early risers who needed to restart fires for preparing the morning meal and for warmth. The embers from the previous evening's fire were examined to see if any remained alive beneath the ash. Live embers were uncovered carefully and small pieces of dry grass or kindling were added to encourage flames. The flames grew slowly as more fuel was added in small amounts until the fire was burning steadily. Smoke from newly started fires drifted upward through roof openings and became visible outside dwellings as dawn light increased. The smoke indicated which households had people awake and active at this early hour of the morning. Other dwellings remained without smoke from their hearths as occupants continued sleeping until later in the morning. The pattern of smoke rising from different dwellings changed as more people woke and started their own fires. Water containers were checked to determine how much water remained from the previous day's supply brought from wells. Low levels in containers meant that trips to the well would need to happen soon after people were fully awake. Sufficient water meant that well trips could be delayed until after other morning tasks had been completed. The checking of water levels was one of the first assessments made each morning in most households. Sleeping mats were rolled up by people who had risen and no longer needed them for resting. The rolling was done carefully to keep the mats in good condition for continued use each night. Rolled mats were placed against walls in their designated storage positions until evening when they would be needed again. The same mats were used night after night until they wore out and required replacement with newly made ones. Doors that had been closed during the night were opened to allow light and air into dwelling interiors. The opening happened as soon as enough daylight existed to make seeing inside the dwellings possible without lamps. Fresh air entered through the open doorways and replaced the stale air that had accumulated during the closed night hours. The movement of air through the dwelling was slight at first and increased as the day progressed. Stretching and movement helped people transition from the stillness of sleep to the activity required for the day ahead. Arms and legs were extended and joints were flexed to restore full range of motion after hours of immobility. The stretching happened without conscious thought as a natural part of the waking process each morning. Some people stretched more thoroughly than others depending on their individual habits and physical needs. Faces and hands were washed using small amounts of water from containers kept inside the dwelling for this purpose. The washing removed sleep from eyes and cleaned skin that had accumulated dust or sweat during the night. Simple cloths were used to dry washed areas before the water evaporated naturally from skin surfaces. The washing was brief and used minimal water to conserve supplies for other necessary purposes throughout the day. Clothing worn during sleep was the same clothing worn during waking hours in many cases without any change. Some people changed into different garments kept for working that were separate from sleeping clothes or better garments. The changing happened in the dwelling interior with minimal attention from others present in the same space. Clean clothing was put on when available or the same worn clothing continued to be used when replacement was not needed. Hair was smoothed by hand or with simple combs made from bone or wood with teeth carved along one edge. The smoothing removed tangles that had formed during sleep from movement on the mats and contact with coverings. Long hair was sometimes tied back with cord or cloth strips to keep it out of the way during work. Short hair required less attention and was simply smoothed into place with damp hands after face washing. Hunger began to be felt by people who had not eaten since the previous evening's final meal hours earlier. The feeling prompted preparation of simple foods that could be eaten quickly before other work demanded attention. Bread from the previous day was consumed with water or with other readily available items that required no cooking. More substantial meals would be prepared later in the morning after initial tasks had been started or completed. Children woke later than adults in many households and remained on their sleeping mats until called to rise. The calling came when adults determined it was time for children to begin their part in the household's daily work. Some children rose on their own when they woke naturally without needing to be called by others. The pattern varied by individual child and by the specific customs of each household regarding morning routines. Conversation in the morning was minimal as people focused on beginning their work without extensive discussion of plans. Most people knew what needed to be done from having performed the same tasks on previous mornings regularly. Words exchanged were brief and related directly to immediate needs or observations about conditions noticed upon waking. Extended conversation would happen later in the day when work allowed time for less focused interaction between people. Tools were gathered from storage locations and checked to ensure they were in proper condition for the day's use. The checking was brief and involved visual inspection rather than detailed examination of each tool's functionality. Tools that appeared damaged or inadequate were set aside for repair or replacement when time allowed for addressing such matters. Satisfactory tools were taken to locations where they would be needed for the morning's first tasks. Work began in various parts of the settlement as people emerged from their dwellings carrying tools and containers. The emergence happened gradually over a period of time rather than all at once in coordinated fashion. Each household operated on its own schedule determined by when people had woken and completed their immediate morning preparations. The settlement became populated with moving figures as the morning advanced toward full daylight conditions. Wells received their first visitors of the day who came to draw water for household use and for other purposes. The visitors formed in formal lines at wells where multiple people arrived at similar times seeking water. Each person waited their turn to lower containers into the well and draw them back up filled. The waiting happened without complaint as everyone understood the necessity of sharing access to the common water source. Conversations at wells were brief and concerned with ordinary matters that required no lengthy discussion or debate. People exchanged greetings and made simple observations about weather or about work they planned to do that day. The conversations ended when water containers were filled and people needed to return to their dwellings with heavy loads. New conversations began as other people arrived at the well to take their turn drawing water. Grain storage buildings were entered by people who needed to obtain supplies for the day's bread making and other food preparation. The entering happened through doorways that had been unlocked or unbarred after sunrise made the interior visible. Containers were filled from larger storage vessels and carried back to individual dwellings for processing into usable forms. The same buildings would be visited again on following days as grain supplies needed continual replenishment in households. Grinding began in dwellings where bread would be made once sufficient flour had been produced from whole grain. The grinding produced its characteristic sound that became part of the morning's background noise throughout the settlement. Multiple households performed grinding at overlap. Ping times creating a general sound that was present without being particularly noticed. The sound would fade later in the morning as grinding tasks were completed in one household after another. Fires received additional fuel to maintain the heat needed for cooking the day's first proper meal after sunrise. The fuel was added in amounts judged appropriate for the cooking time required by the food being prepared. Too much fuel created excessive heat that might burn food, while too little resulted in incomplete cooking. Experience guided the addition of fuel to achieve results that were satisfactory without waste of scarce materials. Smoke from many fires combined in the air above the settlement to create a haze that was visible when observed from outside perspectives. The haze was thickest in the early morning when many fires were burning simultaneously for cooking purposes. As cooking tasks finished in different households, the amount of smoke decreased and the haze gradually dissipated into clearer air. The pattern repeated each morning as part of the settlement's daily cycle of activity. Bread baking began once dough had been prepared and shaped into forms ready for cooking in ovens or on hot stones. The baking required attention to prevent burning while ensuring the bread cooked thoroughly throughout its thickness. People checked bread periodically during baking by observing its color and by touching it to assess firmness. Finished bread was removed from heat and set aside to cool before being consumed or stored for later use. Animals in pens were attended to by people who brought them water and food for the morning feeding. The animals showed signs of recognizing their caretakers and responded to their presence with sounds or movements toward feeding areas. Water troughs were filled first before food was distributed to ensure animals had adequate liquid available with their meal. The feeding happened at approximately the same time each morning, maintaining a consistent schedule the animals appeared to expect. Pens were cleaned by removing soiled bedding material and waste that had accumulated since the previous cleaning session. The removed material was carried to designated disposal areas outside the settlement or to fields where it would be used to improve soil quality. Fresh bedding was spread in the cleaned pens to provide animals with more comfortable surfaces for standing and lying. The cleaning happened regularly according to schedules that prevented excessive accumulation of waste materials. Gates were opened to allow some animals to leave pens and move to grazing areas where they would spend portions of the day. The animals walked through open gates and along familiar paths toward the grazing locations they had used previously. People accompanied the animals to guide their movement and to remain with them during grazing for supervision and protection. The routine was well established through repetition over many days of following the same pattern. Remaining animals stayed in their pens where they would be kept for the entire day for various reasons specific to each animal. Some were being kept for milking at scheduled times while others were recovering from minor ailments or injuries. Young animals were often kept confined while older animals were released to graze in the usual manner. The decisions about which animals to release and which to confine were made based on practical considerations and immediate needs. Streets filled with people moving between different locations as morning work required them to travel to various parts of the settlement. The movement created foot traffic that raised dust from the street surfaces into the air where it hung briefly before settling. People carrying loads moved more slowly than those walking without burdens who could maintain faster paces. The mixing of different paces created variable flows of traffic that adjusted continuously as people navigated around each other. Market areas received vendors who brought items to sell or trade with others in the settlement and surrounding region. The vendors arranged their goods on the ground or on simple tables and positions they occupied regularly for trading purposes. Buyers came to examine the goods and to negotiate exchanges that were acceptable to both parties involved in the transaction. The activity in market areas increased as the morning progressed and more people completed their immediate household tasks. Prices for goods were discussed between buyers and sellers until agreement was reached on acceptable terms for the exchange. The discussions involved comparison with previous transactions and assessment of quality and quantity of items being traded. Some exchanges happened quickly when both parties found the terms obviously fair, while others required extended negotiation. Completed exchanges were followed by transfer of goods and payment in whatever form had been agreed upon. Food items were sold or traded in market areas alongside other goods needed for daily life in the settlement. Fresh produce from gardens and fields was available in quantities that varied by season and recent harvest success. Preserved foods were offered when fresh items were not available or when buyers preferred them for specific purposes. The variety of food items changed throughout the year, but the basic pattern of trading remained consistent across all seasons. Cloth and clothing were examined by potential buyers who assessed the quality of weaving and the suitability for their intended uses. The cloth was felt with hands to determine the texture and thickness of the material being offered. Colors were observed in available light to see if they matched the preferences of the buyer considering the purchase. Negotiations proceeded based on these assessments and on the seller's asking price for the items displayed. Tools and implements were inspected carefully before purchase to ensure they were properly made and would function as needed. Buyers looked for cracks in wooden handles and checked the sharpness and attachment of stone or metal working edges. Sellers pointed out the features of their tools that demonstrated quality construction and materials used in production. The inspection and discussion led to decisions about whether to complete the exchange or to continue looking at other available options. Children accompanied adults to market areas where they observed the process of trading and learned about evaluating goods and negotiating prices. The observation was part of their education in practical matters they would need to understand as adults participating in similar exchanges. Some children were given small responsibilities like carrying purchased items or holding animals while adults conducted their business. The involvement helped children feel included in the important activities of household economic management. Market activity continued through the middle portion of the morning as people completed their trading and purchasing activities. The completion happened when buyers had obtained what they needed or when sellers had disposed of their available goods. Vendors who had sold all their items packed up their empty containers and prepared to leave the market area. Others remained longer with goods still available for potential buyers who might arrive seeking specific items or opportunities. Streets leading away from market areas carried people returning to their dwellings with the items they had acquired through trading. The items were carried in baskets or wrapped in cloth or held directly in hands depending on their size and nature. People walked at steady paces back along familiar routes to their homes where the acquired items would be stored or used. The traffic flow reversed the pattern from earlier when people had been walking toward the market rather than away from it. Dwellings received returning household members who put away their purchases and resumed work that had been interrupted by the market visit. The putting away involved placing items in their designated storage locations where they would remain until needed for use. Some items were prepared for immediate use in cooking or in other tasks planned for that same day. The transition from market activity back to household work happened smoothly as part of the morning's expected sequence of activities. Weaving continued at looms where it had been left when weavers had stopped to attend to other necessary tasks. The continuation required the weaver to recall where the pattern stood and to resume the work without disrupting the established design. Threads were passed through the vertical strands in the same over-under sequence that had been followed before the interruption. The work proceeded at the same steady pace it had maintained during the earlier portion of the weaving session. Pottery work resumed in areas where clay had been left covered to prevent it from drying during the absence of the potter. The covering was removed and the clay was checked to ensure it still had appropriate moisture content for shaping. Additional water was worked into the clay if it had stiffened too much during the time it had been left unattended. The shaping continued from the point where it had stopped with hands forming the clay into the intended vessel shape. Leather work involved cutting and stitching that required steady attention to create items of acceptable quality and durability. The cutting was done along lines marked on the leather surface or following patterns laid on top of the material. Sharp blades were used to make clean cuts through the thickness of the leather without ragged edges that would weaken the finished product. Cut pieces were arranged in the order they would be joined together through stitching or other attachment methods. Stitching required thread to be passed through holes punched in the leather at regular intervals along seam lines. The punching was done with pointed tools that made clean holes without tearing the surrounding leather material unnecessarily. Thread was drawn through the holes in patterns that created strong seams capable of withstanding the stresses of normal use. The stitching proceeded slowly with attention to maintaining consistent tension and spacing throughout the entire seam length. Metal work happened in areas designated for this purpose where heat and noise would not disturb other activities nearby. The work involved heating metal pieces in fires until they became soft enough to be shaped with hammering. The heated metal was placed on solid surfaces and struck repeatedly with heavy tools to change its form. The shaping required many hammer blows to achieve the desired result from the resistant material being worked. Cooling of worked metal happened by quenching heated pieces in water or by allowing them to cool gradually in air. The quenching created rapid cooling that affected the properties of the finished metal in ways that were understood through experience. Air cooling was slower but produced different characteristics in the metal that were preferable for certain types of objects. The choice between cooling methods was made based on the intended use of the metal item being produced. Sharpening of metal tools and blades required grinding against abrasive stones with careful attention to maintaining proper edge angles. The grinding was done with repeated strokes of the blade against the stone surface using consistent pressure and angle. Water was applied to the stone to reduce friction and to carry away metal particles removed during the sharpening process. The sharpening continued until the edge reached a level of sharpness appropriate for the tool's intended cutting or scraping tasks. Testing of sharpened edges was done carefully to avoid injury while determining if additional sharpening was needed or if the work was complete. The testing involved examining the edge visually and feeling it lightly with fingers to assess its keenness. Some tools were tested by using them on scrap materials to observe their cutting performance under actual working conditions. Satisfactory results ended the sharpening process while inadequate results prompted additional work to improve the edge further. Stone carving created objects from hard materials that resisted shaping and required sustained effort to achieve desired forms. The carving used harder stones or metal tools to chip away unwanted material from the piece being shaped. Each blow removed a small amount of stone and the work progressed slowly toward the final intended shape. The carving produced sharp fragments that needed to be cleared away regularly to maintain visibility of the work surface. Polishing of carved stone happened after the basic shape had been achieved through the rougher carving process described previously. The polishing used finer abrasive materials applied to the stone surface with rubbing motions that gradually smoothed away roughness. Water or oil was sometimes used with the abrasive to create a paste that worked more effectively than dry abrasive alone. The polishing continued until the surface reached a smoothness level considered acceptable for the object's intended purpose or decorative value. Bone working transformed animal bones into useful items through processes similar to those used for working wood or stone. The bones were cut to appropriate lengths using saws or by controlled breaking at weakened points created through careful scoring. Shaping of cut bone pieces happened through scraping and grinding to remove excess material and create desired forms. The bone material was harder than wood but softer than stone and required techniques adapted to its particular properties. Drilling of holes in bone or other hard materials required pointed tools rotated under pressure to gradually penetrate through the material thickness. The rotation was created by hand movements or by bow drills that provided continuous rotation with less physical effort. The drilling proceeded slowly to avoid breaking the tool or cracking the material being drilled through excessive force. Completed holes were smoothed by passing cords through them repeatedly to remove rough edges that might cause breakage during use. Horn from animals was softened by heating or soaking and then shaped into useful objects while in the softened state. The shaping had to be completed before the horn cooled or dried and returned to its hard and flexible condition. Shaped horn was held in the desired form until it hardened again and retained the new shape permanently. The process required timing and experience to achieve good results without wasting the horn material through errors in heating or shaping. Cord making continued through the day as an ongoing task that could be interrupted and resumed without significant difficulty. The twisting of fibers happened in the hands of workers who maintained consistent tension and rotation to produce uniform cord. Multiple strands of single-ply cord were combined into stronger multiply versions through additional twisting in the opposite direction. The finished cord was wound into balls or coils and stored until needed for tying or stitching or other applications. Basketry work involved weaving plant materials into containers of various sizes and shapes needed for household and field work. The weaving started with a base structure that was built up through the addition of new strands woven into the growing form. The weaver maintained even tension on all strands to create a basket that held its shape when filled with contents. Completed baskets were set aside to dry fully before being put into service for carrying or storing materials. Afternoon heat increased as the sun reached its highest point and began the gradual descent toward evening. The increase in temperature caused people to seek shaded areas where work could continue with less discomfort from direct sunlight. Movement between sun and shade happened naturally as people positioned themselves for tasks that required different amounts of light. The adjustment to heat was a familiar part of each day's progression through its warmest hours. Water consumption increased during the hottest part of the day as people needed to replace moisture lost through sweating. Containers holding drinking water were accessed more frequently and their contents diminished more rapidly than during cooler morning hours. Trips to wells for refilling containers happened when household supplies ran low enough to make additional water necessary. The increased water use was expected and did not cause concern unless well levels dropped significantly during dry periods. Rest from heavy physical labor happened more often during peak heat as people took breaks from strenuous activities that were easier to perform in cooler conditions. The rest periods involved sitting in shaded locations and performing lighter tasks that did not require significant physical exertion. Some people used rest time to eat small amounts of food or to simply remain still while waiting for temperatures to moderate. The pattern of working and resting shifted throughout the day in response to changing comfort levels and energy. Animals sought shade in their pens or in grazing areas where trees or structures provided protection from direct sun. The seeking of shade was instinctive and the animals positioned themselves in cooler spots without guidance from their handlers. Water consumption by animals also increased during hot weather and required more frequent refilling of troughs and other drinking containers. The animals remained relatively inactive during the hottest hours and resumed more active grazing when afternoon temperatures began to decline. Dust hung in the air above streets and work areas where movement and activity stirred it up from dry ground surfaces. The dust created a haze that reduced visibility slightly and made breathing less pleasant for people working in affected areas. Dampening of dust through water application was sometimes attempted, but the effect was temporary as the moisture quickly evaporated in the heat. Most people simply accepted the presence of dust as an unavoidable aspect of living in the dry conditions of the settlement. Food prepared during midday heat was often simpler than meals made in cooler parts of the day when cooking fires were more comfortable to maintain. The simplicity involved using items that required minimal heating or that could be consumed without any cooking at all. Bread from earlier baking was eaten with stored foods that needed no preparation beyond removal from their containers. The reduced cooking effort conserved fuel and avoided adding unnecessary heat to dwelling interiors already warmed by outside temperatures. Flies and other insects were more numerous during warm weather and required constant attention to keep them away from food and people. The attention took the form of waving hands or cloths to disturb insects before they landed on exposed skin or food items. Coverings were placed over food containers to prevent insects from accessing contents and potentially contaminating them with disease or simply making them unpleasant to consume. The effort to control insects was ongoing and never completely successful despite consistent attempts. Repair work on various items continued as an everyday activity that addressed the constant wear and deterioration of tools and household objects. The work involved examining items to identify damage and determining what could be fixed versus what needed complete replacement. Simple repairs were done immediately using materials and techniques readily available to the person doing the work. More complex repairs were set aside for times when appropriate. 8. Materials or assistance from skilled workers could be obtained. Checking of stored items happened periodically to ensure they remained in good condition and had not been damaged by pests or moisture. The checking involved opening containers and examining contents by sight and sometimes by smell to detect any problems. Items showing signs of spoilage were removed and discarded to prevent contamination from spreading to surrounding stored materials. The checking was done more frequently for foods that spoiled easily and less often for durable items like tools or cloth. Sweeping of dwelling interiors happened multiple times throughout the day as dust and debris accumulated from various activities and from air movement through open doorways. The sweeping was a brief activity that took only a few moments to complete in most rooms. Swept material was pushed outside through doorways where it joined the dust already present in streets and courtyards. The same floors would need sweeping again later as new dust and debris accumulated in the continuous cycle. Reorganizing of stored items occurred when access to frequently used objects became difficult due to poor arrangement or when storage areas became cluttered. The reorganizing involved removing items from storage and replacing them in more logical positions based on frequency of use. Items used daily were placed where they could be reached easily, while less frequently needed objects were moved to less accessible locations. The organization improved efficiency of household operations until gradual disorder required another reorganization session. Wood for fuel was split into smaller pieces when supplies of kindling or cooking fuel ran low in household storage areas. The splitting was done using wedges and hammers or axes to break larger chunks into sizes appropriate for different uses. Small pieces were set aside for kindling while larger pieces were kept for maintaining cooking fires over longer periods. The splitting produced noise that carried through the settlement as multiple households performed the same task at overlapping times. Bark was stripped from wood intended for construction use to prevent insects from damaging the material while it was stored. The stripping was done using knives or specialized tools that separated the bark from the underlying wood without cutting into the useful material. Stripped bark was sometimes saved for use in other applications where its properties made it valuable for specific purposes. The stripped wood was stacked in dry locations where it would season before being incorporated into building projects. Thatch for roofing was prepared by bundling dried grasses or reeds into manageable bundles that could be transported and applied to roof surfaces. The bundling required tying the plant materials securely to prevent them from coming apart during handling and installation. Finished bundles were stacked near buildings where roof repairs were planned or stored for future use when needed. The preparation could be done during time between other tasks since it did not require continuous attention or difficult physical effort. Mud for building and repairs was prepared by mixing soil with water in proportions that created workable consistency for application. The mixing happened in shallow depressions or containers where the materials could be combined thoroughly through stirring and kneading. Plant fibers or straw were sometimes added to the mud to provide reinforcement that reduced cracking as the material dried. Prepared mud was used while still workable and any excess was covered to prevent drying until it could be applied. Application of mud to walls or other surfaces required spreading it evenly using hands or flat tools that smoothed the material into place. The spreading had to be done before the mud began to stiffen from moisture loss, which happened relatively quickly in dry, warm conditions. Applied mud was smoothed repeatedly as it began to set to create surfaces as flat and even as possible. The drying process continued after application was complete and could take several days depending on weather conditions and mud thickness. Cracks that formed in drying mud were filled with additional applications of fresh mud worked into the gaps with fingers or small tools. The filling prevented the cracks from expanding and potentially compromising the strength or protective qualities of the repaired surface. Multiple applications were sometimes needed as each layer dried and created new smaller cracks that required their own filling. The process continued until the surface remained stable without developing new cracks as it fully cured. Inspection of completed repairs happened after sufficient time had passed for materials to dry and harden to their final state. The inspection looked for any remaining problems that needed additional attention or for signs that the repair had failed to address the original issue adequately. Successful repairs required no further work and the repaired items were returned to normal use in household activities. Failed repairs prompted decisions about whether to attempt another repair or to replace the item entirely with a new version. Work continued through the afternoon at paces adjusted to account for heat and the accumulated fatigue from earlier exertions. The continuation meant that tasks left unfinished from morning periods were addressed during these later hours when possible. Some work was postponed until the following day when it became clear that completion before evening was unlikely. The decisions about what to continue and what to postpone were made based on immediate necessity and available energy. Grain stalks that had been cut during harvest were gathered into bundles and tied with cord or twisted grass for easier handling. The bundles were stacked in positions where they would remain until further processing could remove seeds from the stalks. The stacking was done carefully to allow air circulation that would prevent moisture accumulation and potential spoilage of the grain. Completed stacks were left in fields or moved to storage areas depending on immediate plans for processing the harvest. Sorting of harvested produce removed damaged or diseased items from the usable portions that would be consumed or stored. The sorting was done by examining each piece individually and making quick judgments about its condition and suitability. Rejected items were set aside for disposal or for feeding to animals if the damage did not make them completely unusable. Accepted items were placed in containers for transport to dwellings where they would be stored or prepared for consumption. Transport of heavy loads from fields to the settlement required multiple trips or the use of animals to carry larger quantities. The transport happened along paths worn smooth by repeated use for the same purpose over extended time periods. People walking with loads moved slowly and rested periodically to maintain their strength for completing the journey. Animals used for carrying were loaded carefully to distribute weight evenly and prevent injury from unbalanced burdens shifting during movement. Unloading at the settlement involved removing items from carrying containers or from animal-borne loads and placing them in designated storage locations. The unloading required care to avoid dropping items and causing damage that would reduce their quality or usability. Multiple people sometimes worked together to handle particularly heavy or awkward loads that were difficult for individuals to manage alone. The unloading proceeded until all transported materials had been removed and properly stored or distributed to their intended locations. Evening preparation began during late afternoon as people anticipated the approaching end of the working day and planned accordingly. The preparation involved finishing tasks that needed completion before darkness made continuing work difficult or impossible without artificial light. Some tasks were brought to convenient stopping points where they could be resumed easily on the following day. The transition toward evening routines happened gradually rather than at any specific moment determined by external signals. Cooking fires were built up again as preparation for the evening meal required sustained heat for an extended period. The building up involved adding larger pieces of fuel that would burn longer and provide steady heat without constant attention. Pots were cleaned from their previous use and filled with ingredients for the evening's food along with water for cooking. The preparation of the meal happened while other tasks continued until the cooking required more direct supervision and attention. Stirring of cooking pots happened at intervals to prevent food from sticking to the bottom surface where it might burn and create unpleasant flavors. The stirring was done with wooden implements that would not damage the ceramic surfaces of the pots or react with the food being prepared. Frequency of stirring depended on what was being cooked and how easily it tended to stick during the cooking process. Some dishes required nearly constant stirring while others needed only occasional attention to prevent problems. Tasting of food during cooking allowed cooks to assess whether seasonings were adequate or if additional flavoring needed to be added. The tasting was done carefully with small amounts taken on fingers or spoons to sample the developing flavor of the dish. Adjustments were made based on these samplings until the cook determined the food had reached satisfactory taste for serving. The process relied on experience and personal judgment rather than on any measured quantities or standardized recipes followed precisely. Bread distribution happened at the evening meal when pieces were broken and handed to each person present for eating. The distribution followed household customs regarding who received portions first and how large each portion should be relative to others. Elders and working adults typically received larger portions while children received amounts appropriate to their smaller appetites and needs. The distribution happened without discussion as everyone understood the usual pattern followed in their particular household. Eating together at the end of the day provided time for household members to be in the same location simultaneously after working in different areas. The time together allowed for conversation about the day's events and for making plans regarding work to be done tomorrow. Children learned about adult concerns and responsibilities through listening to these discussions even when they were not directly participating. The shared meal served social functions beyond simply providing nutrition to those who consumed the food. Cleaning after the evening meal happened as it had after earlier meals, with containers being washed and returned to storage positions. The cleaning was done in fading daylight or in early darkness if the meal had extended into the time after sunset. Water used for cleaning was often the same water that had been used for cooking, with additional fresh water added if needed. The cleaned containers were left to dry overnight and would be ready for use again the following morning. Settling of animals for the night involved ensuring they had adequate food and water available during the hours of darkness ahead. The ensuring required checking feeding areas and water troughs one final time before people retired to their own dwellings for sleep. Animals that appeared distressed or uncomfortable received additional attention to determine if any problems needed addressing before morning. Most animals settled quietly into their resting positions without requiring any intervention from their handlers during the night. Securing of pens and enclosures happened as darkness approached to prevent animals from wandering away during the night hours. The securing involved checking gates and barriers to ensure they were properly closed and would remain that way until morning. Weak points in fences or walls were noted for repair during the following day when materials and daylight made the work possible. The checking was a routine precaution rather than a response to any specific concern about animal security in most cases. Pathways between dwellings became less traveled as people completed their outdoor activities and moved inside for the evening. The decreased traffic allowed dust to settle and the air to clear somewhat from the suspended particles raised during busier periods. Streets that had been filled with movement during daylight hours stood empty except for occasional late travelers moving between locations. The emptying of streets marked the transition from public daytime activity to private evening time within household spaces. Lamp lighting began in dwellings as natural light faded to levels that made seeing difficult for continuing indoor activities. The lighting followed the procedures established through daily repetition of preparing wicks and oil for burning safely through evening hours. Flames from multiple lamps created enough light for people to continue working on tasks that could be done in artificial illumination. The light was dimmer than daylight and cast shadows that made some detailed work more difficult than it would have been earlier. Shadows moved across walls and floors as lamp flames flickered from air currents moving through dwelling interiors. The moving shadows were a familiar aspect of evenings spent by lamplight and drew no particular attention from people accustomed to them. Children sometimes watched the shadows and found patterns or familiar shapes in their movements across surfaces. Adults focused on their work and largely ignored the shadow movement as irrelevant to their current tasks and concerns. Conversations during evening hours covered topics that had not been addressed during the busier working portions of the day. The conversations allowed people to share information about events they had witnessed or heard about from others in the settlement. Stories from the past were retold as entertainment and as a way of preserving memories of earlier times for younger listeners. The talking continued until people became too tired to maintain interest in the discussion and turned their attention to preparing for sleep. Yawning indicated growing tiredness as evening progressed toward the time when sleep would replace waking activities as the primary occupation. The yawning was contagious and spread through household members as fatigue accumulated from the day's physical and mental efforts. Resistance to sleep diminished as comfort and warmth from the dwelling interior combined with exhaustion to make remaining awake increasingly difficult. The transition to sleep preparations happened naturally without anyone announcing that the time had come to end the day. Sleep preparations began with the same sequence of actions that happened each evening in every household throughout the settlement. The sequence was so familiar that it required no conscious thought about what needed to be done next. Sleeping mats were retrieved from their storage positions against walls and unrolled in the locations where they would remain through the night. The unrolling happened quietly to avoid disturbing anyone who might have already settled down to rest earlier than others. Blankets or coverings were arranged over the mats in layers that would provide warmth appropriate to the season and expected nighttime temperatures. The arranging was adjusted based on how cool the previous night had been and whether similar conditions seemed likely tonight. Extra coverings were kept available nearby in case the night became colder than anticipated and additional warmth was needed during sleep. The arrangement of bedding was one of the final tasks before people actually lay down to begin sleeping. Removing outer garments happened in some households where people changed into different clothing specifically kept for sleeping purposes. The removing was done in the privacy of the dwelling interior with little attention from others present in the same space. Removed garments were folded or hung on pegs attached to walls where they would remain until morning when they would be put on again. The practice of changing clothes varied among different households based on their customs and the availability of extra garments. Washing before sleep involved using small amounts of water to clean hands and faces one final time before lying down. The washing removed the accumulated dust and sweat from the day's activities and made people feel more comfortable for sleeping. Minimal water was used since supplies were limited and would be needed for other purposes the following morning. The washing was brief and focused only on exposed skin areas rather than on full-body bathing, which happened less frequently. Prayers or quiet words were spoken in some households as part of the transition from waking to sleeping states. The words followed familiar patterns that had been repeated countless times before in the same household setting. Children learned these words through hearing them each night and eventually joined in speaking them as they grew older. The speaking was done in low voices that would not carry beyond the immediate dwelling to disturb neighboring households. Positioning on sleeping mats involved finding comfortable arrangements of limbs and body that would allow sleep to come easily. The positioning required adjustment as different positions were tried and rejected before settling on one that felt acceptable. Some people fell asleep quickly in whatever position they first assumed, while others shifted multiple times before finding comfort. The variation in individual sleeping habits was accepted as normal and did not attract comment or attention from others present. Darkness was complete in dwellings once all lamps had been extinguished and no light remained except faint illumination from outside sources. The darkness made seeing impossible, and people relied on familiarity with their surroundings to move if necessary during the night. Most people remained still once they had settled onto their mats and did not move except to shift position occasionally during sleep. The stillness and darkness combined to create conditions that encouraged sleep to arrive and deepen through the night hours. Breathing sounds from sleeping people became the primary noise in dwellings after all other activities had ceased for the night. The breathing was steady and quiet in most cases, with occasional variations when sleepers shifted position or moved through different sleep phases. Snoring happened in some individuals and could be heard by others in the same dwelling space throughout the night. The sounds of breathing and snoring were familiar and generally did not wake people who had become accustomed to them. Dreams occurred during sleep, though people had no way to observe or measure this phenomenon directly during the night. The dreams were sometimes remembered upon waking and were occasionally discussed among household members in the morning. Some dreams were interpreted as having significance or meaning related to future events or current concerns in people's lives. Most dreams were forgotten shortly after waking and left no lasting impression on those who had experienced them during sleep. Waking during the night happened occasionally when sounds or physical discomfort interrupted sleep temporarily before it resumed again. The waking was brief in most cases, and the person returned to sleep without rising from their mat or disturbing others. Sometimes the waking was prompted by need to relieve oneself, which required getting up and going outside the dwelling briefly. The disruption to sleep was minimal, and most people fell back asleep easily after returning to their mats. Outside sounds continued through the night, though they were different from the sounds present during daylight hours of activity. The sounds included occasional animal noises from pens and natural sounds from wind or insects active during darkness. Dogs sometimes barked at disturbances they detected, which might wake light sleepers temporarily before quiet returned and sleep resumed. The nighttime soundscape was familiar to settlement residents who had heard the same patterns repeatedly on previous nights. Temperature dropped during night hours as heat from the day radiated away into the clear sky above the settlement. The dropping temperature caused some people to pull coverings closer around themselves without fully waking from sleep. The cooling was gradual, and most people adjusted to it unconsciously by changing position or adding layers from nearby blankets. Morning would bring warmth again as the sun rose and began heating the settlement structures and the air surrounding them. Stars visible through roof openings or doorways moved slowly across the sky, following their predictable paths through the night. The movement was too slow to be perceived directly, but observation at different times showed that positions had changed significantly. People who woke during the night sometimes looked at star positions to estimate how much time remained until dawn would arrive. The stars provided the only reliable indication of time passage during the dark hours when other markers were not visible. Roosters began crowing before dawn when the first hints of approaching daylight triggered their calling response to the changing conditions. The crowing started with one bird and was soon joined by others in a pattern that spread through the settlement and surrounding areas. The sound signaled that morning was approaching, though full daylight would not arrive for some time after the first crowing began. People still sleeping when crowing started might wake briefly or might continue sleeping until later when more light had developed. Pre-dawn darkness was different from full night darkness, as the sky began showing faint illumination that grew gradually brighter over time. The change was subtle at first and difficult to detect, but became more obvious as the process continued toward actual sunrise. Stars faded from visibility as sky brightness increased and made them impossible to see against the lightning background. The transition from night to day happened through this gradual progression rather than through any sudden change at a specific moment. Stirring began in some dwellings as early risers woke and began their morning routines while others continued sleeping. The stirring was quiet to avoid waking those who were still asleep and wanted to remain so until later. Early risers moved carefully in the dim light available before full dawn had arrived to illuminate dwelling interiors properly. The gradual increase in activity marked the beginning of a new day that would follow patterns similar to the day just ended. Embers and hearths were checked to see if any remained alive from the previous evening's fire that had been banked carefully. Live embers made starting the morning fire easier, since they only needed new fuel added to restart flames. Dead hearths required creating new fire from sparks or from embers borrowed from neighboring dwellings where fire had been maintained successfully. The checking happened early so that fires could be burning when full morning activity began and cooking was needed. Cold air inside dwellings prompted people to move closer to hearths once fires were burning and providing warmth again. The movement toward warmth was instinctive and happened without conscious decision in most cases as people sought comfort from the chill. Morning temperatures were coolest just before sunrise when the night's cooling had reached its maximum effect on the settlement. Warming would begin soon after sunrise as solar heating counteracted the cooling that had occurred during darkness. Repetition of daily patterns meant that each morning was similar to the previous morning in most observable ways. The similarity created a predictable rhythm to life that required little decision-making about what to do next. People knew what tasks needed attention and when they should be performed based on long experience following the same patterns. The predictability provided stability and allowed efficient completion of necessary work without wasted time or effort on planning and organization. Days continued in succession without particular distinction between one day and the next in terms of activities performed. The continuation meant that the same tasks were repeated at the same times following the same methods used previously. People moved through their work knowing what needed to be done without requiring instruction or guidance from others. The familiarity of repeated actions made the work proceed smoothly without interruption from uncertainty about proper procedures or techniques. Seasons changed gradually over long periods with shifts in temperature and rainfall that altered growing conditions in fields. The changes were expected and people adjusted their activities to match the requirements of each seasonal period. Planting happened when conditions were right for seeds to germinate and plants to establish themselves in soil. Harvesting happened when crops reached maturity and needed to be gathered before weather could damage them or they passed their peak quality. Years passed with the same seasonal cycles repeating in regular succession without significant variation from established patterns. The passing of years was marked by harvests completed and by the aging of people and animals in the settlement. Children grew larger and took on more demanding work as their strength and skill increased with age. Elders became less able to perform heavy labor and shifted to lighter tasks that matched their declining physical capabilities. Generations succeeded each other as older people died and younger people matured to take their places in household work structures. The succession maintained continuity in knowledge and practices that were passed from parents to children through demonstration and participation. Young people learned by watching and by doing the same tasks they had seen performed by their elders countless times. The learning was gradual and happened through daily exposure rather than through formal instruction sessions set apart from regular work. Buildings required ongoing maintenance to remain habitable as materials deteriorated from age and weather exposure over time. The maintenance involved the same types of repairs that had been performed since the buildings were first constructed in earlier times. Walls were replaced when surfaces became too damaged to provide adequate protection from elements or when appearance declined to unacceptable levels. Roofs were patched or completely replaced when leaks became too numerous to address through small individual repairs alone. Tools wore out from use and needed replacement with new versions made using the same designs and methods. The replacement was continuous as some tools failed while others remained functional for extended periods depending on use patterns and material quality. New tools were made to match old ones exactly since the designs had proven effective through long experience. Innovation happened rarely and changes to tool designs were small increments rather than complete redesigns of familiar implements. Storage containers broke or developed leaks and were replaced with new containers made from the same materials as before. The making of containers was an ongoing activity that provided replacements for failed items and additional capacity when household needs expanded. Pottery continued to be shaped from clay and fired in kilns using techniques that had changed little over many generations. Baskets were woven from plant materials in patterns that had been used for as long as anyone could remember. Food preparation followed recipes and methods that had been established through trial and experience over extended time periods. The methods were effective for producing edible and reasonably palatable meals from available ingredients without waste or excessive effort. Changes to cooking methods happened slowly if at all, since familiar approaches produced reliable results without risk of failure. People ate the same types of foods prepared in the same ways their parents and grandparents had eaten before them. Clothing styles remained consistent across generations, with only minor variations in details or decorative elements occasionally appearing. The consistency reflected the practical requirements of clothing for work and the limited range of materials and techniques available for production. New garments were made to replace worn ones using the same patterns and construction methods that had been used for previous versions. The wearing of clothing followed customs regarding what was appropriate for different ages and for different types of activities or occasions. Social customs governed interactions between people in ways that had been established over time through repeated practice and general acceptance. The customs covered greetings exchanged when people encountered each other and proper behavior in various common situations that arose regularly. Deviations from accepted customs were noticed and might prompt correction from others or simply disapproval shown through expressions or tone. Adherence to customs provided predictability in social interactions and reduced the need for negotiation about appropriate behavior in familiar situations. Marriages joined households and created new family units that would continue the settlement's population into future generations. The marriages followed procedures and customs that had been used for previous marriages in the community without significant innovation. Young people were paired through arrangements made by their families based on practical considerations about combining resources and labor capacity. The newly married couples established their own households or joined existing ones depending on available space and family structure preferences. Births added new members to households and to the settlement population as women gave birth to children at intervals throughout their fertile years. The births happened in dwellings with assistance from experienced women who knew how to help with delivery and immediate care of newborns. Infants were cared for by mothers and other household members who ensured they received adequate feeding and protection from harm. The care of infants required significant time and attention that affected the ability of mothers to perform other household work during early months. Deaths removed people from the settlement through disease or injury or simply through the accumulated effects of aging on bodies. The deaths were expected as a natural part of life and were addressed through established customs for disposal of bodies and for mourning the deceased. Bodies were buried in designated areas outside the settlement or disposed of through other methods appropriate to local customs and conditions. The mourning period lasted for a time determined by custom, and then normal activities resumed with the deceased's former responsibilities distributed among remaining household members. Illness affected people periodically with varying severity, from minor discomfort to serious conditions that prevented normal activity for extended periods. The illness was treated with available remedies and through rest that allowed bodies to recover their normal functioning over time. Some illnesses passed quickly while others persisted for longer periods or resulted in permanent changes to affected individuals' capabilities. Knowledge of effective treatments was limited, and many illnesses simply had to run their course without intervention beyond basic supportive care. Injuries occurred during work or through accidents and required treatment to prevent infection and to promote healing of damaged tissues. The treatment used simple methods involving cleaning wounds and binding them with cloth to keep them protected from dirt. Serious injuries might heal poorly or might result in permanent disability that affected the injured person's ability to work effectively. Minor injuries healed without complications and left no lasting effects on the injured individual's capabilities or activities. Weather varied from day to day with changes in temperature and precipitation that affected comfort and work efficiency but rarely prevented necessary tasks. The variation was monitored through observation of sky conditions and through feel of air temperature and humidity levels. Extreme weather was infrequent, but when it occurred it could disrupt normal activities and require shelter or postponement of outdoor work. Most weather fell within ranges that allowed normal work to continue with only minor adjustments to timing or methods used. Disputes between people arose occasionally over property boundaries or over obligations not fulfilled according to expectations of affected parties. The disputes were resolved through discussion between the parties or through intervention by respected community members who could mediate disagreements. Most disputes were settled without lasting damage to relationships since people needed to continue working together in the small settlement community. Serious disputes that could not be resolved might result in one party leaving the settlement to live elsewhere away from the source of ongoing conflict. Cooperation between households happened when tasks required more labor than single families could provide or when shared resources needed collective management. The cooperation was organized informally through discussions among involved parties about who would contribute what effort toward the shared goal. Projects like well maintenance or defensive wall repairs benefited all households and were accomplished through coordinated effort from multiple families. The cooperation generally worked adequately since everyone understood the mutual benefits from maintaining common infrastructure and resources properly. Work continued each day with the same tasks performed in the same ways they had been performed before. The continuation required no planning since everyone knew what needed to be done from having done it repeatedly. Hands moved through familiar motions that had been repeated so many times the movements happened without conscious direction. The work proceeded at steady paces that were sustainable over long periods without causing excessive fatigue or strain on bodies. Morning routines began when light appeared and people rose from their sleeping mats to start the day's activities. The routines involved the same sequence of actions that had marked every previous morning in the settlement. Water was drawn from wells and carried back to dwellings in containers that had been used for this purpose countless times. Fires were started in hearths using methods that had proven reliable through long experience with the available materials and conditions. Grain was ground into flour using stones that had been used for grinding since they were first shaped for this work. The grinding produced the sound that marked morning hours in households throughout the settlement as the same task happened in dwelling after dwelling. Bread was made from the flour and baked in ovens or on hot surfaces near fires that provided the necessary heat. The bread was consumed at meals along with other foods that had been prepared using familiar recipes and techniques. Fields were tended by people who walked to them along paths worn smooth from repeated use over extended time. The tending involved the same actions of planting and weeding and watering that fields had always required for producing crops. Tools were carried to the fields and used to work soil and tend plants growing in rows that extended across the cultivated areas. The work in fields continued through appropriate seasons following patterns established through generations of agricultural practice in the location. Animals were cared for each day with feeding and watering and attention to their health and housing needs. The caring happened at regular times in the daily cycle when people were accustomed to performing these tasks. Pens were cleaned to remove waste and to maintain conditions suitable for keeping animals in good health over long periods. The animals remained in their pens or were released to grazing areas depending on the specific practices followed for each type of animal kept. Storage areas held supplies of grain and other preserved foods that had been accumulated through harvests and through preparation activities. The areas were checked regularly to ensure contents remained in good condition and were not being damaged by moisture or pests. Items removed from storage for use were replaced eventually by new supplies when harvest times brought additional food to be preserved. The cycle of storing and using and replenishing continued without particular attention to its repetitive nature or to its essential role in survival. Tools were maintained through sharpening and repair when they showed signs of wear from the work they performed daily. The maintenance used the same methods that had been used for maintaining similar tools in earlier times when previous generations had performed the same work. Worn tools that could not be repaired adequately were replaced with new versions made to match the old ones exactly. The replacement ensured that work could continue without interruption from lack of functional implements needed for various tasks. Clothing was worn and washed and mended in cycles that kept garments serviceable for extended periods before replacement became necessary. The washing happened when garments became too soiled to wear comfortably or when household schedules allowed time for this task. Mending addressed small tears and worn areas before they expanded into damage requiring complete replacement of the garment. New clothing was made when old garments could no longer be repaired adequately to serve their protective and modest functions. Meals were prepared at regular times throughout each day using ingredients available from storage and from recent gathering or production activities. The preparation followed familiar patterns of combining foods and applying heat to make them palatable and digestible for consumption. People ate together in household groups or ate individually depending on the timing of their work and the customs of their particular household. The eating provided necessary nutrition and also served as a regular interruption in work that marked time passage through the day. Conversations happened between people as they worked together or rested in the same locations during breaks from labor. The conversations covered topics familiar from previous discussions about weather and work and people known to those talking. Information was shared about observations made or about plans for upcoming work that might involve coordination between households. The talking served social functions of maintaining connections between people and of passing time during periods of rest or light activity. Children learned through watching and through participating in tasks alongside adults who showed them proper methods through demonstration and correction. The learning was gradual and happened over years as children grew and became capable of performing increasingly demanding work. Skills were acquired through repetition rather than through formal instruction separate from actual productive work in households and fields. The transmission of knowledge from older to younger generations maintained continuity in practices across time without requiring written records or deliberate teaching sessions. Seasons changed with shifts in weather patterns that brought different conditions for growing crops and for maintaining comfort in dwellings. The changes were anticipated through observation of signs that had proven reliable for predicting upcoming seasonal shifts in past years. Activities were adjusted to match seasonal requirements, with planting happening in appropriate seasons and harvesting happening when crops matured adequately. The seasonal cycle provided structure to the year and determined when different types of work needed to be performed. Buildings required ongoing attention to keep them in serviceable condition as materials deteriorated from age and exposure to weather over time. The attention took the form of small repairs performed regularly to address minor problems before they developed into more serious damage. Walls were maintained with applications of mud plaster to fill cracks and to protect underlying structure from moisture penetration and erosion. Roofs were patched when leaks appeared or when visual inspection revealed areas where materials had deteriorated enough to require replacement soon. Paths between dwellings and between the settlement and surrounding fields remained in their established positions through continued use by foot traffic. The paths were worn into the ground surface through the passage of many people over extended time walking the same routes repeatedly. Maintenance of paths involved smoothing areas where erosion or traffic had created uneven surfaces that made walking difficult or uncomfortable. The work on paths was minimal since they were simply worn areas rather than constructed surfaces requiring regular upkeep to maintain their function. Days succeeded one another without particular distinction in most cases, as the same activities were repeated in regular cycles. The succession created a rhythm of work and rest that structured time into predictable patterns requiring minimal decision-making. People woke and worked and ate and rested and slept in sequences that varied little from one day to the next day. The predictability meant that life proceeded smoothly without disruption from uncertainty about what should be done or when it should be done. Wells provided water that was drawn each day and carried to dwellings for the various uses requiring liquid in household activities. The wells were maintained through periodic cleaning and through repairs to wall structures that prevented collapse of the excavated openings. Water levels in wells varied with seasonal rainfall patterns but generally remained adequate for settlement needs throughout most years. The drawing of water from wells was one of the most frequent activities performed daily by people in every household that depended on this shared resource. Fire remained essential for cooking and for warmth and for light during hours when natural illumination was insufficient for work. The fire was maintained through regular addition of fuel and through attention to keeping flames alive in hearths overnight so morning fires could be started more easily. Gathering of fuel for fires was an ongoing task that required regular trips to areas where wood and other burnable materials could be collected. The importance of fire made its maintenance a priority that was addressed consistently without requiring special attention or planning beyond normal household routines.